Thank you, Jonathan. I also want to thank Boaz Ganor and Shabtai Shavit for their kind invitation to return to Israel and address the 15th ICT International Conference. I know that Boaz is going to formally acknowledge them later, but I really want to add my personal thanks to Stevie Weinberg, Larina, Devra, Orit, and the other members of the splendid ICT staff for their warm hospitality and kind assistance during this visit and my previous visits. This morning, I want to add my assessment, continue the assessments of the current situation in the Middle East that were offered in the excellent presentations yesterday. I really should point out here that there is no other forum that I know of that offers such informed analysis of this subject matter and of the region. And it is a great privilege for me to be able to attend these conferences. Yesterday, we heard from we listened to the leading voices in Israel on these issues. And today and the remaining days, we will have we'll hear more from our Israeli colleagues, as well as a number of people who internationally were the pioneers in the study of terrorism, people who were present at the creation, people like Martha Crenshaw and Alex Schmidt, Magnus Ranstorp, and even youngsters like Rohan Gunaratma and David Gartenstein-Ross, Matt Levitt, Peter Neumann, Earl Suthers. I mean, their experience is measured individually in decades, collectively in centuries. And that is an enormous achievement. Now, I'm not going to assert that time guarantees wisdom. It does not. For every wise man, there's a bunch of old fools. But like satellite photography, it does offer a different perspective. And that perspective over the years can often be useful. Now, this morning, I'm not going to try to speak from high altitude. I'm going to try instead to dig beneath the often bewildering headlines in order to discern the underlying dynamics of the current conflicts in Syria and Iraq, and to see how these, in my view, are going to shape the future of the region and drive security concerns in the region and in countries far beyond. In a forthcoming RAND paper, I'm making 9 observations. The first is that the conflicts in Syria and Iraq are currently at a stalemate. That doesn't mean that fighting is over, but I think that we're going to see fighting at the edges, consolidations of strongholds. A town may fall, it may be recaptured, it may fall again, but essentially the government forces will not be able to restore their authority throughout the national territories. The government of Iraq, even with US and Iranian assistance, is not going to be able to put the state of Iraq back together again, to defeat its opponents. The government of Syria, the Assad regime, even with Iranian, Hezbollah, Russian assistance, are not going to be able to restore their authority. At the same time, on the other side, neither are their adversaries going to be able to establish and maintain their control over the entire states of Syria or Iraq, even if their governments fall. The rebel forces never really achieved military victories in the real sense. What happened instead was that armies collapsed, forces became unreliable, they were hollow, in some cases they were withdrawn, and their challengers filled in the space. I would agree with General Dagon's comments yesterday. ISIS is losing momentum. The whole thing is losing momentum. Again, that doesn't mean the fighting won't be intense. It is that we are not going to see anything approaching military success by either side. The second observation is that these conflicts are now driven almost entirely by sectarian and ethnic hostilities, making it a matter of survival for all sides. No participant in the struggles, not the Kurds, not the Sunnis, not the Shias, not the Alawites, can see themselves surviving under rule by their opponents, given what has happened in the last 5 years. It's interesting to take a map of the current positions, by the way, and superimpose it on a map that shows the sectarian and ethnic breakdowns in the country, and there is a strong degree of overlap and correspondence. Third is that national armies, the national armies in Iraq and the national army in Syria, national armies have failed. Power has shifted to rebel formations and militias that even when they are fighting on behalf of governments are not under the control of central governments. And that has an effect also on the nature of the fighting. Militia groups and formations are ferocious fighters when they're defending their own territory. They are less mobile forces in a strategic sense. And so that changes the nature of the fighting. But it also has a longer range effect, and that is as a result of power shifting away from national armies, from governments having a monopoly on power, it means that central authority is now going to be weaker. And this suggests perhaps a return to the kind of instability, political instability, that we saw in both countries in the 1950s and 1960s. My fourth observation, which relates to this, the third, is that Syria and Iraq are now effectively partitioned. These divisions will persist. Iraq will be divided roughly into a Shia area, a Kurdish north, a Sunni west. The mosaic in Syria is more complex, but we will see the same kinds of divisions. Now, there are some in the Arab world that see this as a Western imperial plot. It is not that, but it is the resulting reality from the fighting. My fifth observation is that the future within that mosaic in both countries, the future of Syria's and Iraq's Sunnis remains uncertain. They have no military formation to protect them other than the jihadist and Salafist groups that are now in the field, that dominate the rebellion in Syria and hold major cities in Iraq. Now, the question going forward is, will the Sunni portions of Syria and Iraq be dominated by an Islamic State that is able to consolidate and defend its positions, or, lacking government institutions, will it become a kind of tribal Sunni badlands that just represent a long-term problem? My sixth observation is that the fighting will continue for the foreseeable future. A decade, a generation at least. This is going to go on. There are few incentives and no capability to bring this to a close. The seventh observation is that foreign powers adjacent to these conflicts and more distant foreign powers have their own objectives and support their own protégés to advance these objectives. But without a major military investment, the outsiders will remain at the margin of the conflicts. This applies to the United States, it applies to Iran, to Turkey, to Russia. The American-led bombing campaign has driven the Islamic State back in some areas, while ISIS has advanced in others. But even the proponents of the bombing concede that the air campaign will have to go on for many years. And indeed, I would agree with the comments yesterday that air power alone cannot succeed in destroying ISIS or the other organizations. Critics, especially in the United States, have therefore called for a more substantial American engagement. But even if the Islamic State could be defeated as easily as some of the proponents of a more aggressive and ambitious strategy suggest, the United States and any allies who joined it would still face protracted insurgencies and terrorist campaigns. I mean, if there's any lesson from Afghanistan and the Iraq War, it is that it is easy militarily to disperse some of these foes. It is extraordinarily difficult to pacify them. And it's not clear that such an undertaking would be able to maintain the necessary public backing. In the aftermath of wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the United States military is anxious to avoid large-scale ground deployments to combat terrorists or to counter insurgencies. That's their preferred position anyway. It does not necessarily reflect weakness. In this case, the reality may impose a certain degree of caution and wisdom. My eighth observation is that the refugees that have been generated by this conflict will be unable to return. Syrian counterinsurgency strategy is not Western counterinsurgency strategy. It's not based upon providing security or winning hearts and minds. It is based upon making life untenable in zones that are not controlled by the government, destroying infrastructure, destroying commerce, destroying public health, destroying education. And we see the consequence of that is that more than 50% of the population of Syria are displaced persons, either displaced internally or about 4 to 5 million of them displaced externally. Those who are in Jordan and in Lebanon cannot be easily absorbed or assimilated. Their numbers compared to the population of these countries is simply too great. It would significantly alter the political composition of these countries. These refugees are destined to become the new Palestinians. Stateless, a source of continuing instability. And there has been, in my view, a failure to recognize the long-term security threat that is being created by that situation. My ninth observation is that these conflicts, in particular the jihadist groups, and especially the Islamic State, have attracted tens of thousands of foreign fighters. And that poses a new dimension to the threat. It also changes the internal dynamics. If we're looking at numbers of 25 to 30,000 foreign fighters in the region, most of them with the Islamic State. And if we look at that in terms of the total numbers that are in the forces of the Islamic State, foreign fighters make up a large portion of its fighting strength. They have no futures other than fighting in that organization. And that is an argument against any kind of settlement. They also pose a security problem to their home nations. Now, these conclusions that the conflicts are at a stalemate, that they are driven primarily by sectarian and ethnic divisions, that Syria and Iraq's standing armies have failed and cannot suppress the challenges to government authority. The power has shifted to the militias, that the partitions in both countries will persist, that national unity will not be restored, that the future of the Sunnis remains uncertain, that the fighting will continue, that without a significant military investment, the foreign powers are on the margin, that the thousands of foreign fighters warp the strategy and operations of ISIS and pose a long-term security threat, that the millions of refugees will not be able to return. These conclusions are hardly controversial. Nothing said yesterday contradicts them. And yet they are antithetical to the presumptions upon which current American policy is based. The very idea of endless military stalemate defies America's sense of progress. Secular, democratic governance, religious tolerance are deeply held American values. We Americans believe that all divisions can be bridged, that Iraq's national army can be rebuilt into an effective fighting force, that the Assad regime can be replaced by a more inclusive government, that the Sunnis can be won over again, that the jihadists can be defeated, that peace and unity can be restored, enabling the refugees to return, and that all of this can't be achieved without a major military investment. Now, these are noble aims, and diplomats must be optimists, but nonetheless, national objectives must be realistic and based on realistic assessments. Here, the distance between aspirations and reality seems great. Thank you very much.